My name is Victoria Lane. I am 42 years old. On the 14th of March, in a ballroom on the 14th floor of the Langham Hotel in Washington, D.C., a man in a $30,000 suit crossed the entire length of the room to reach me. My mother-in-law Celeste was standing 3 feet to my left. She had spent the previous 2 years telling anyone who asked that her son had married a woman who works airport security. The man who crossed the room was Ambassador Raphael Ortega of Colombia. He stopped in front of me. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he bowed. Not a nod, not an incline of his head. A full, formal bow from the waist in front of approximately 200 people. When he straightened, he said, in English, that he chose with the care of a man choosing words for their permanence. This woman saved my life. I heard Celeste draw in a breath beside me. I did not look at her. I had been waiting 2 years for someone to say something true in front of those people. Not for applause, not for vindication in the way the word is usually meant. I had been waiting for the silence that comes when a fact lands in a room and no one can take it back and everyone present knows they cannot take it back. That silence came. I stood in the center of it. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt exactly like who I am. My name is Victoria Lane, and I want to tell you how we got to that ballroom, because the ballroom is not the beginning of this story. No story that matters starts at its best moment. It starts in the long quiet that comes before the best moment, in the years of small erosions that nobody notices until the ground gives way. This story starts in October of 2021, at a function at the State Department headquarters on C Street Northwest, where I was working a protection detail for a deputy assistant secretary, and I watched a man in a charcoal suit standing by the window look at me with exactly the kind of attention I had been taught to flag as a security risk, and then realized, after 3 seconds of professional assessment, that he was not a threat in that sense. He was just looking at me the way people look when they want something and haven't figured out yet how to ask for it. He came over. He introduced himself as Edmund Harrington III. He said the third with a small, self-aware pause that I later came to understand was his way of acknowledging how ridiculous the third sounded, which was also his way of telling me he knew how it sounded without having to say it outright. I told him my name. He asked what I did. I told him I worked for the Diplomatic Security Service. He nodded and said he'd been to State Department events his entire life and had enormous respect for the people who did this work. I said thank you the way you say thank you when someone tells you something you believe they mean but have not yet understood. He asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I said I'd think about it. He gave me his card. I put it in my jacket pocket and continued working my shift. 3 days later, I called the number on the card. I want to be honest about that. We dated for 8 months. Edmund was thoughtful in the specific way that people who have always been listened to become thoughtful, because they never had to compete for space in a conversation, and so they learned, over a lifetime, to give it. He was funny in a way that surprised me, dry and quick, not performing. He listened with his full body, leaning slightly forward, asking questions that proved he had retained what I said the last time. He knew what the DSS does. He understood that I wasn't a rent-a-cop standing at an airport checkpoint waving a scanner wand. He had been to enough State Department functions in his life, trailing his father Gerald through diplomatic receptions and ministerial dinners, to understand the difference between the visible layers of security and the people who actually carry the most critical responsibility. He told me once, on our 4th or 5th date at a Thai place in Georgetown that he had picked because he'd asked around and found out I liked Thai food, that he had enormous respect for what I did. I believed him then. I want to tell you that I still believe he meant it then. What he did with that belief later is a different part of the story. We got married on a Saturday in October of 2022. The ceremony was at Edmund's parents' estate in McLean, Virginia. The house had 14 rooms and a converted carriage house and gardens that required a full-time groundskeeper named Roberto, who had worked for the Harringtons for 11 years and who was, as far as I could determine, the warmest person on the entire property. I wore a dress that had been my mother's. She passed when I was 33, a stroke, sudden, and the dress had been in a box in my apartment for 9 years by the time I opened it the week before the wedding. I had it altered at a shop in Arlington for $80. The seamstress pinned the shoulders differently and took in the waist because my mother was smaller than I am. And when I put it on for the final fitting, I looked in the mirror and thought, okay, and put my shoulders back the way I always put my shoulders back when I am about to walk into a situation that requires me to be fully present. Celeste Harrington came to see me before the ceremony. She walked into the room where I was getting ready, looked at the dress, and said, "How vintage." Then she smiled with her teeth and moved to greet someone else. I noticed it. I filed it. The reception was long and beautiful in the way that events planned by people who have always had money are long and beautiful, which is to say they were beautiful without effort, the way expensive things look effortless, because the effort happens so far upstream that it's invisible by the time anyone sees the result. I met Edmund's people that night. His father, Gerald, who was 68 and had spent 40 years in international finance, and who shook my hand with the kind of practiced warmth that people in finance develop the way athletes develop muscle, efficiently, for a purpose, and then told me that Edmund had spoken highly of me and that he was glad Edmund had found someone with a practical career. He said practical the way people say practical when they mean not glamorous. His Aunt Patricia, who asked 3 times in the space of an hour what exactly I did for work, and each time I explained, and each time she said, "ah," and then went back to talking to someone else. His cousin James, who was Edmund's age and worked in venture capital, and who asked me which airline I worked for. I told him again that I worked for the State Department. He said, "Oh, right, the feds," and then moved on. I watched Edmund across the room talking to people who had known him since he was 10 years old, and I watched him light up with a warmth I hadn't yet seen in all our months together, and I thought, he is home, and I am still being introduced to home. That was fine. I knew it would take time. The first months of marriage were good in the ways that matter, the private ways. We had a house in Alexandria, a 19th century row house that Edmund had bought 6 years before we met, and that still had all his books and his things and very little room for mine, which we fixed slowly by getting rid of 2 bookshelves he admitted he'd kept only because they'd looked good in photographs. He made coffee in the morning before I was awake because he knew I needed it the way I need it, which is strong and black and in a large cup. And he left it on the counter with a lid on it, so it was still hot when I got up. On the mornings I worked early shifts, he would be asleep when I came home, and I would find a plate covered in foil in the oven on warm. These are the things that made the larger things harder. It is always harder to be disappointed by someone who leaves coffee and keeps dinner warm. The Harrington family dinners began in February. Every second Sunday, the Harringtons gathered at the McLean estate for dinner. Edmund had always attended these dinners. When he married me, I attended too. I understood this was a condition, not a preference. The way certain things in a marriage are conditions rather than preferences, the load-bearing walls that you don't knock down even when you'd like to reconfigure the space. I attended. I wore my good clothes. I brought a bottle of wine that a friend who knows about wine had helped me pick. I sat at the table. Celeste always placed me at the far end, near the kitchen, in the seat that had the leg that rocked slightly when you shifted your weight. I noticed this the first time and thought it was accidental. I noticed it the third time and filed it differently. The airport security thing started in March. I don't know exactly when the assumption formed, whether it was Gerald saying something to someone at a club or Celeste fitting what she knew about my job into a category she recognized and then never questioning the category. What I know is that at the March dinner, Edmund's Uncle Richard, who was visiting from Boston and who had the specific brand of entitled warmth that men of his generation and class develop, the kind where condescension is delivered as affection so reliably that the man himself has stopped being able to tell the difference, said to me across the table, "So, Edmund tells me you're in airport security." I said, "I work for the Diplomatic Security Service. I protect American diplomatic personnel and facilities overseas." He said, "Ah, so like, at the airports when the diplomats fly?" I said, "Not exactly." He said, "Fascinating," and went back to his soup. I looked at Edmund. Edmund was talking to his father about a mutual fund. I looked at my soup. I ate my soup. By April, the assumption had calcified. Celeste mentioned to me once, in passing, while we were standing near the garden, waiting for dinner to be announced, that her friend Margaret had a daughter who worked for TSA and that it must be nice having a government job with that kind of job security, no pun intended. Celeste said, and then laughed lightly as though she had made a clever joke, which in her mind I believe she had. I said, "I don't work for TSA. I'm a DSS special agent." Celeste said, of course. And the way she said it told me she had not updated anything. She had simply filed my correction away in the same drawer where corrections go when the person receiving them has already decided what they know. I went inside to help bring out the bread because I needed to do something with my hands. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being misread by people you cannot exit. It's not the exhaustion of conflict. Conflict would have been easier. Conflict would have been honest. What I was experiencing was the exhaustion of being made into a smaller version of myself in a house I visited every 2 weeks by people who did not see any reason to look harder. I had been in rooms where people's lives depended on how quickly I could assess a threat, make a decision, and move a body to safety, and I was sitting at a dinner table in McLean, being asked if I liked my government job with its good benefits and its stable hours. I am telling you about this exhaustion because I want you to understand what I carried into that gala in March of 2024 and why what happened in that ballroom landed the way it landed. Not just in the room, in me. Edmund did not correct them. That is the part I returned to. In the car driving home from those dinners, in the mornings before he was awake, in the locker room, at the gym where I went at 5:30 in the morning to keep my left shoulder functional, he did not correct them. I told myself, the first few months, that he did not realize how pervasive the misunderstanding had become. I told myself he was conflict averse with his family in ways he hadn't fully disclosed to me yet. I told myself a lot of things that kept the alternative interpretation at arm's length, because the alternative interpretation, which was that he knew and chose silence, was a thing I was not ready to hold in December of 2022. I became ready to hold it later. That is the nature of truths you're not ready for. They wait. My work during this period was the same as it had always been. I did not have a glamorous assignment. After Bogotá, which I will tell you about, I had been stateside for 8 months of rehabilitation and then reassigned to a protective operations role in Washington that kept me in the district and out of the high-risk postings that my shoulder would no longer fully support. I coordinated security logistics for visiting foreign dignitaries, assessed vulnerabilities in diplomatic facilities, ran training scenarios for newer agents. I attended functions like the Langham Gala regularly, not as a guest, but as the person responsible for making sure the guests were safe. I carried a sidearm. I wore an earpiece. I wore good clothes because DSS agents at diplomatic events are dressed to blend, not to mark themselves, and good clothes are part of the job the way good aim is part of the job. I had the kind of knowledge about risk and protocol and human behavior under duress that takes years to accumulate and cannot be summarized at a dinner table to an uncle from Boston who has already decided he knows what you do. None of this changed at the McLean dinners. None of this mattered to the people at those dinners. I went in on Sundays and came home on Sunday evenings and sat with the quiet, specific weight of being unseen by the people in my own domestic life. The Christmas dinner of 2023 was the one that I would have told you, until recently, was the worst. Gerald was telling a story about a business trip to Heathrow where he'd had trouble with customs and then had an altercation with a security officer over his carry-on. He was telling it as an indignity story, which is the kind of story people tell when they believe that being made to follow the same rules as everyone else is a particular injustice. He reached the part of the story where the security officer had pulled him aside and he said, looking directly at me with a smile that was meant to be including but functioned as condescending, "You would know more about this than we would, wouldn't you, Victoria?" The table turned to me. Celeste said, "Yes, Victoria, you deal with this kind of thing all the time, the travel security." Edmund was to my right. He was eating a piece of bread. He did not say anything. I said, "I don't work in travel security, Gerald. I work in diplomatic protection. It's a different discipline." Gerald said, of course, but you understand the protocol, yes?" And before I could answer, he continued the story. Because the story was never about me. I was a prop in the story. I was local color. I finished my dinner. Edmund asked on the drive home if I had a good time. I said yes. He said great. We listened to the radio. I looked out the passenger window at the highway. There is a specific quality to the silence of a person who is not saying something important. I had been trained to read rooms, trained to notice the thing that was wrong before it became visible, and I had not turned that training on my own marriage because that is the deal we make with ourselves when we are in love with someone. We extend to them the very mercy we would not extend to a threat assessment. I turned it on eventually. I turned it on in the weeks after that Christmas dinner. Edmund knew. He had always known what the Harringtons believed about my job. He had chosen not to correct them in the same way. He chose not to argue with his mother about the seating arrangements and not to push back on his father's opinions about investments and not to make waves at a table that he had been trained from childhood to keep smooth. He was a people pleaser in the way that people raised to be heirs to something become people pleasers, because the cost of the inheritance is the appearance of harmony, and Edmund had been paying that cost his entire life without noticing the payment. I understood this. Understanding it did not make it hurt less. Priya Nakamura has been my closest friend since we trained together at the Foreign Affairs Security Training Center in Dunloring 14 years ago. She is the kind of person who will tell you the exact truth at the exact worst moment because she believes strongly that you deserve the exact truth even when the moment is bad, which is an excellent quality in a friend and occasionally a devastating one. She left DSS 3 years ago to do security consulting for a firm that works with State Department contractors, and she still moved in the same diplomatic circles I did, which is how she ended up at the Langham Gala in March of 2024. She is also the reason I went to the gala, dressed the way I was dressed. Priya had been to one of the McLean dinners, a July 4th gathering the previous summer to which Edmund had invited her because he liked her and thought it would be good for me to have a friend present, which was kind of him in one direction and oblivious of him in another direction. She sat at the table and watched and listened and did not say anything that day. She filed it. Priya files things the way I file things, carefully, for later. 3 weeks before the Langham Gala, she took me to a salon and then to a department store and stood outside the fitting room while I tried on a dress that was the color of dark green water, the kind of deep green that you only see in the depths of things. It had long sleeves because my left shoulder scar, which runs from the top of my shoulder blade to halfway down my upper arm and is approximately 4 inches long and wide as a thumb, is not something I am ashamed of, but it is also not something I owe anyone. When I came out of the fitting room, Priya looked at me for 3 full seconds and said, "Wear that." I said, "It's a lot." She said, "Wear it anyway." In the car outside the gala, she told me what she'd heard at the July 4th gathering. She had been near the kitchen, refilling her water glass, when she heard Edmund's voice and then his mother's voice. She did not mean to listen. She listened anyway, because that is what a person with 16 years of surveillance training does. Celeste had said, "I'm telling you, Edmund, she's a nice woman, but this is not what I had in mind for you." Edmund had said, "Mom." Celeste had said, "I'm not being unkind. I'm being practical." She works security at an airport. She drives a truck that's 12 years old. She brought a bottle of wine to Easter dinner that cost $14. Edmund had said, "Let it go." Celeste had said, "I will not let it go, because I love you and I want more for you, and I hope when you're ready you'll see that too." Edmund had said nothing. Then the door to the kitchen had opened and a cousin had come in and the conversation was over. Priya told me this in the car outside the Langham Hotel with the engine running and the heat on and the city's lights collecting on the windshield in the way city lights collect on glass when it's raining, which it was. She told me plainly, the way she told me everything, and then she watched me hear it. I sat with it for a moment. I said, "He didn't tell her I don't work at an airport." Priya said, "No." I said, "And he didn't tell you that he'd told her." Priya said, "No." I said, "Okay." I looked at the hotel entrance. People were going in. Women in long dresses, men in suits, the specific choreography of a formal Washington event. I turned off the engine. I said, "I'm going in." Priya said, "Yes, you are." I said, "I'm going in and I'm doing my job and I'm not going to think about any of that tonight." Priya said, "You're going to think about all of it tonight." I said, "Yes, but not until after." She said, "Fair enough." We got out of the car. I need to tell you about Bogotá before I tell you about the ballroom, because the bow was about Bogotá, and Bogotá is the thing that neither Celeste, nor Gerald, nor Edmund's Uncle Richard from Boston, nor any of the people at those McLean dinners knew when they looked at me and saw a woman who checks carry-on bags at Dulles. I was posted to Bogotá in the fall of 2019. I was lead agent on the protective detail for Ambassador Raphael Ortega, who had been posted to Colombia for 3 years and who was, in my professional assessment, one of the more security-conscious ambassadors I had worked with. which is to say, he listened when we told him things and did not argue about protocol in the way that some principals argue, as though the protocol were an affront to their importance rather than a condition of their survival. I liked working his detail. He was direct, undemanding in the specific ways that matter in a protection job, and he had a quiet quality of paying attention to the people around him that I had come to associate with individuals who had actually thought about what kind of person they wanted to be and had then become that person rather than just deciding they were already that person by virtue of their position. The attack happened on the 4th of November, 2019, at 17 minutes past 6 in the evening, during a reception at the embassy compound. There was an ongoing security assessment of the perimeter at the time. I had flagged a concern about a service entrance that had been used more frequently than usual over the preceding 48 hours and had requested a review that had not yet been completed. Later, this would matter. At the time, it was a note in a report. 3 armed individuals entered through that service entrance. The first indication was gunfire in the east corridor, which was away from the main reception hall but close enough that we heard it. I had been standing 6 feet from Ambassador Ortega when the sound came. I put my hand on his arm and said, "Sir, we need to move." We moved. The shooter reached the reception hall anteroom before we reached the secondary exit. I had the ambassador behind me, low, and I was moving him toward the door when the first shot came. I do not want to dramatize what happened next because I was trained for it and I was doing my job, and training is what you do when everything else fails. When fear and thought and conscious decision-making are too slow, you fall back to the thing your body knows. My body knew to cover him. I covered him. The bullet entered my left shoulder from approximately 9 meters, and I processed the impact the way you process an impact when you're in the middle of an action, as data, as information about your body's current status, not yet as pain. The pain came later. What I did first was get the ambassador through the door. 12 other protected personnel were moved to secondary safe positions over the next 27 minutes. I directed the extraction from a position near the door while a colleague applied field pressure to my shoulder and another colleague coordinated with Colombian National Police. No one died. 2 of the attackers were apprehended. 1 escaped and was captured 4 days later at a crossing point in the northern part of the country. I was medically evacuated the following morning. I spent 3 weeks in a military hospital in San Antonio where they put my shoulder back together with surgical hardware and physical therapy that I began the following day because I was told I needed to begin it immediately if I wanted to recover the range of motion that my job required, and I wanted that. I wanted it the way you want, the things that define you when you are afraid of losing them. The ambassador sent flowers to the hospital. He sent a letter. He sent, through State Department channels, a formal commendation that sits in my personnel file and that I have never shown to anyone, not Edmund, not Celeste, not any of the people at the McLean dinner table, because showing it would have required explaining why I had not shown it already, and the answer to that was something I did not know how to say out loud in those rooms. I was not a hero. I want to be clear about that because people often apply that word to situations like Bogotá, and the word does a disservice to the actual nature of what happened. What happened was that I was in a situation that my training had prepared me for, and I did what my training had prepared me to do. I was afraid. Of course I was afraid. The absence of fear in those situations does not make someone brave. It makes them damaged. I was afraid and I did the job, and the shoulder healed to approximately 87% of its previous capability, and I went back to work. That is the whole story of Bogotá, except for the ambassador. Except for the fact that the ambassador had been looking for me. The Langham Ballroom is one of those Washington spaces that exists specifically to make foreign dignitaries feel that Washington takes itself seriously enough to be taken seriously in return. High ceilings, chandeliers the size of small cars, a crowd of people who've spent their entire careers learning to move through rooms like this without looking like they're trying. I worked the room the way I always work rooms, aware of the exits, aware of the people whose safety I was responsible for that evening, aware of the particular geography of the crowd that tells you where the center of gravity is and who is circling it. Edmund had been invited as a guest through his father's professional connections. I knew he would be there. Celeste and Gerald were there too, which I had not known until I saw them near the bar when I came in. Celeste saw me in the dark green dress and said, "How glamorous. You look different without the work clothes." I thanked her. I did not explain that I was wearing my work clothes. I saw Priya across the room and she raised her glass at me. I circulated to where she was and we stood together for a few minutes talking about a mutual colleague's transfer to the Nairobi posting, and then I moved to check in with the senior agent on the evening's detail. Edmund found me near the far windows. He said I looked beautiful. He said it the way he sometimes said things, with his whole face open, completely sincere, and I thought, yes, this is who you are. Someone who means it and also cannot say the harder things, and I do not know yet what to do with that. I said thank you. He said his parents were there. I said I saw. He said his mother had said something about my dress. I said I know. He touched my arm and went to find his father, and I turned back to the room. I was standing near the east entrance with my earpiece in and my attention distributed across the space the way it always is in these environments when I became aware of a shift in the crowd's geometry near the main entrance. Someone was moving through people with purpose. Not the social purpose of a person working the room, but the directed purpose of a person going somewhere specific. I located the movement. I identified Ambassador Ortega. He was taller than I remembered him. Or perhaps he had always been tall and I had only seen him in positions of vulnerability, crouched, moving, protected. He was upright now. He was crossing the room. He was looking at me. I did not move. This is something you learn, that stillness can be a kind of readiness, that the impulse to retreat or to look away is usually a response to someone else's definition of a situation, and you do not have to accept someone else's definition. I stood still. He crossed the room. Celeste was to my left, 3 feet away, and I knew this because I had been aware of her proximity for the previous hour, in the way I was always aware of the positions of the people in rooms where I was responsible for the shape of the space. Celeste was telling Gerald something about a mutual friend's renovation. She did not notice the man crossing the room. She noticed when he stopped. He stopped in front of me. He was perhaps 18 inches away, which is the distance a person stands when the moment is formal and they want the formality to be legible. He looked at me for a long moment. The moment lasted perhaps 4 seconds and contained, for me, the particular quality of a pause before something true is said, the kind of truth that both people in the conversation already know and one of them is about to say aloud. He bowed, from the waist, formally, the way you bow when you mean for the bow to be seen. The conversations nearest to us stopped first, then the conversations near those conversations, the way sound travels in water, moving outward in rings. By the time he straightened, the room had come to a kind of attention. Not silence, exactly. The room's attention, which is different. He said, in the English he had chosen carefully, I have spent 4 years trying to find the right way to say this in public. He said, this woman saved my life and the lives of people in my care. He said, she did it without hesitation and without expectation, and I have never forgotten it and I will never forget it. Then he turned to the room and said, her name is Victoria Lane and she is one of the finest agents the Diplomatic Security Service has ever produced, and it is my honor to be in the same room with her tonight. The room made a sound. Not applause yet, something before applause, the sound of 200 people exhaling. I heard Celeste draw in a breath on my left. I heard Gerald say something very quietly that I couldn't make out. I heard Priya from across the room make a sound that I knew was her, trying not to cry and then succeeding through the force of her particular will. The applause came. I accepted it the way you accept things you didn't prepare for but don't need to run from, by standing still and letting it be what it was. I said, thank you, Ambassador. I said, I was doing my job. He said, yes. He said, and your job is more important than most of the people in this room will ever understand. He looked at me with the specific directness of someone who has been thinking about saying something for a long time. Then he shook my hand. Both hands, the formal diplomatic handshake, and I felt the pressure of it in my left shoulder in the specific way. I feel pressure there when the hardware reminds me it's there. I did not let it show. He moved on. He was a diplomat. The work continued. I turned to look at Celeste. I did not plan to. My body turned. She was standing with her champagne glass held very still in both hands, and she was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in the 2 years I had known her. Not shame, exactly. Not remorse. something closer to the particular expression a person wears when they have been standing in a room in which they did not understand the proportions, and the proportions have just become clear. Gerald was beside her, with his hand on her elbow, and his face carefully arranged into an expression of polite neutrality that was doing considerable work. Edmund was 15 feet away near a column. He was looking at me. His face was completely open. It reminded me of the way he had looked in that Thai place in Georgetown on our fourth or fifth date. Open and present and slightly behind the moment, processing. He was processing. I looked at him for a moment and then I turned to speak to the next person who was waiting to speak to me. For the next hour, I stood in the center of something I had not expected. People came to me, ambassadors, attachés, senior State Department officials, an undersecretary whose name I recognized from congressional hearings on diplomatic security. They shook my hand. They said my name. They said versions of what the ambassador had said, with their own specific knowledge appended to it, because this was Washington, and everyone in the room had received the report about Bogotá in some form. Everyone in the room operated in a world where what happened in Bogotá was information that mattered, and they had not connected that report to the woman at the Harrington family dinners who brought $14 wine to Easter dinner. They were connecting it now. Priya found me at one point and stood beside me without speaking, which is exactly what I needed from her, presence without commentary. Later, she would cry in the car and attribute it to the humidity. I looked for Edmund twice during that hour and found him both times near the periphery of the room, watching. He was not talking to his parents. He was not talking to anyone. He was watching me move through a room in which I was, for the first time in his family's presence, the person I had always been. I did not know what he was feeling. I had some thoughts about what he was feeling. I put them away. I found Celeste near the end of the evening. I had not planned to find her. I went to the powder room near the south corridor of the ballroom level, a small space with marble counters and mirrors, and the specific quiet of a room that is built specifically to give women a moment away from a room they have been performing in. She was in there when I arrived. She was standing at the counter with both hands gripping the edge of the marble, and she was looking at her own face in the mirror with an expression that I understood immediately, because it was the expression of a person who has just received information that requires them to significantly revise something they believed. And revision is exhausting, and the exhaustion is showing. She looked up when I came in. She saw me in the mirror first. Then she turned. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. I ran the cold water and washed my hands. My shoulder ached from the hardware responding to the cold water, which it does sometimes. I dried my hands. I looked at her. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She was going to say something, and then she did not say the thing she was going to say. She said, instead, I didn't know. The syllables were very small. I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. She said, Edmund didn't. He didn't tell us. And I looked at her then, the way I look at things, I want to understand fully before I respond. And I said, he knew what I do, Celeste. He has always known. She absorbed this. I watched her absorb it. I said goodnight, and I went back to the ballroom. Edmund found me near the coat check at the end of the evening. He said, can we talk? I said yes. We said goodbye to the people nearby, and we walked out of the hotel into the March night, which was cold and damp and smelled like the Potomac when the wind comes from the south, like water and distance. We walked to the car. He drove. We were on the bridge before he said anything. He said, I'm sorry. I said, for which part? He said, for not correcting them. I said, for which part of not correcting them? He was quiet. I watched the bridge lights pass. He said, for all of it. I said, do you understand why that mattered? He said, yes. He said, I kept thinking, I'll tell them. But then it felt like it would cause a whole thing. And I kept delaying the whole thing. And then enough time had passed that it felt impossible to go back and say, actually, and I didn't. He stopped. I said, Edmund, your mother told you I wasn't right for you. At your parents' house. In July. He was very quiet. I said, I know. I know she said it. I know you were there. He said, how? I said, Priya heard. He said nothing. We were off the bridge now and on the parkway with the river on one side and the hill on the other and the city receding behind us. He said, "She's not right about everything, V." I said, "I know." I said, "But you stayed quiet." He said, "I know." And we drove for a while. He said, "I'm telling you, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." I said, "I'm gonna need some time to figure out what I do with the sorry." He said, "Okay." He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too." I said, "That's not the question." He said, "I know." We drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was not comfortable and was not hostile, that was simply honest, which is a kind of silence I had not had with Edmund in a long time, and which felt, in its own painful way, like progress. There is a version of this story where the ambassador's bow fixes everything, where Celeste becomes a different person and Edmund becomes a braver one, and the McLean dinner table becomes a place where I feel seen, and all of it is resolved in the warm light of public recognition. That is not this story. Recognition does not fix people. It does not reach far enough into the places where people's fears about themselves live to move those fears. What it does is change the terms. It shifts the geography. The people around you can no longer stand confidently in their assumptions because their assumptions have been made visible, and visible things can be named, and named things are no longer ambient. Named things are facts on a table. You can work with facts on a table. Celeste called me 3 days later. She did not apologize in the clean way that apologies are supposed to happen in stories. She said, "I want to understand your work better." She said it stiffly, like someone who has rehearsed the sentence and knows it's not good enough and is saying it anyway, because they have decided that an imperfect attempt is what they have. I said, "Okay." She said, "Could we have lunch?" I said, "Yes." I don't know what will come of the lunch. I don't know if Celeste Harrington has the will or the flexibility or the particular courage required to update a map of the world that has been stable for 70 years. I know that the invitation happened. I know that something moved. Edmund told his parents the week after the gala. What I do, the full version. He told them about the diplomatic security service and the nature of the work and Bogotá and the surgery and the hardware in my shoulder and the commendation in my file and the years of a career that he had not described to them because he had been managing their comfort at the expense of my visibility. He told me he did this on a Sunday morning over coffee in our kitchen, not presenting it as an achievement, but reporting it as something he had done and that I deserved to know he had done. I said, "Thank you." He said, "It's years late." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know that doesn't go away." I said, "You're right. It doesn't." He put his coffee down and came around the counter and stood in front of me the way he stood in front of me when he meant something, with his full body. And he said, "I'm asking for the chance to be better at this." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I know." He said, "Is that a yes?" I said, "It's a we'll see." He said, "Okay." He picked up his coffee. We stood in the kitchen in the particular morning light that comes through the east windows in our house when the time shifts in March and the sun comes in at a different angle, and it was not a resolution, but it was a beginning, which is what most mornings are if you're paying attention. I drove to the gym the following Monday at 5:30, the way I always drive to the gym at 5:30, in the old F-150 that Edmund has been trying to get me to replace for 2 years. I did the shoulder exercises that the physical therapist in San Antonio told me I should do every morning for the rest of my career if I wanted to keep the hardware functional. I did them slowly, the way you do things that matter, when there's no one watching. There was no one watching. That was fine. I have done most of the things that mattered in my life without anyone watching. The watching has never been the point. I have been turning something over since the night at the Langham, and I want to say it directly because this story is not complete without it. There are people who spend their entire careers doing the critical, invisible, load-bearing work of the world, the work that the world cannot function without, and those people are often surrounded by other people who have assigned them a smaller story than the one they actually inhabit. Sometimes the world corrects this. An ambassador crosses a room. A fact becomes visible. The smaller story collapses under the weight of the real one. But most of the time there is no ambassador. Most of the time the woman who held the line does not get the bow. She gets the dinner table with the rocking leg. She gets the uncle from Boston who asks which airline she works for. She carries the full weight of what she has done, and she sits with it quietly, the way she sits with everything that matters, which is to say she does not put it down, because the thing that defines you is not an object you can set on a counter. It goes with you, into the gym at 5:30, into the kitchen where the coffee is waiting, into the 20 years that come next, whatever shape they take. What I know now, standing on the other side of that evening in the ballroom, is that the bow was not about me being seen by the right people in the right room. The bow was what happened when the truth, which had always been the truth, was finally in a space where it could not be argued with. The room caught up to the truth. That happens sometimes. But the truth had been there the whole time. The truth was in the shoulder and the hardware and the 5:30 gym and the commendation in the file and the 11 months of protection details in Bogotá and everything that came before and after. The truth did not begin the night of the gala. It did not need the gala to be true. Neither do you. Whatever you carry that no one at your table has bothered to ask about, whatever load-bearing thing you have been doing in rooms where you are called by the wrong job title and offered the chair with the rocking leg, that work is real. That knowledge is real. The room catching up to it is only a moment. The work was always the whole story. Some things do not need to be seen to be true, but when they are finally seen, the silence that follows is something you will carry for the rest of your life, differently than you carried everything before it, more lightly, because you know now that the weight was never yours to prove. I want to go back to one more thing. I want to go back to the dinner table in McLean in October of 2023, which was not the Christmas dinner and was not the first dinner, but was the one that I have thought about most in the time since Bogotá became a word that people in that house knew meant something. There was a woman at that dinner, a friend of Celeste's named Dorothy, who had been a diplomat's wife for 30 years and who had been at functions like the Langham Gala dozens of times and who understood the shape of that world. She had sat next to me at dinner and had asked, pleasantly, what exactly it was that I did. I had explained. She had listened. She had said, "Oh, so you're in protection?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My husband had a protection detail for 2 years when he was posted to Beirut." I said, "Yes, I know a number of people who worked Beirut postings." She said, "Extraordinary people, those agents." I said I agreed. She said, "You must have remarkable stories." I said I had a few. She was called across the table by Celeste before she could ask more, and the conversation ended there, and Celeste later steered Dorothy toward Edmund's cousin James and his venture capital work, and that was where Dorothy spent the rest of the evening. I watched this happen. I did not say anything about it to Edmund on the way home because I was still deciding what category to put it in. Later, I decided it was a pattern, not a coincidence. It was curation. Celeste was curating the conversations I was allowed to have at her table. I tell you this because I want you to understand the full architecture of what being dismissed looks like when it is done by people who have social intelligence and resources and a long practice of managing their world's impressions. It is rarely dramatic. It is rarely a raised voice or an outright insult. It is the redirected conversation. It is the seating arrangement that keeps you slightly outside the table's center. It is the repeated mischaracterization that is never quite directly challenged because challenging it directly would cause, as Edmund put it, a whole thing. It is the accumulation of small architectural choices that each seem, in isolation, like nothing, and which in aggregate create a room that has a different shape than the one you thought you were in. I had been trained to read the architecture of physical spaces for threats, to understand how a room's geometry could be used against a protective principle or in favor of one. And I turned that training eventually on the architecture of the McLean dinner and saw what it was. The training is good for a great many things. What I did not let happen, even during the worst of it, was permit the architecture of that dinner table to become the architecture of how I understood myself. This is harder than it sounds. The human mind is extraordinarily susceptible to the environment in which it spends the most time. And if you spend enough time in a room where you are treated as a minor figure, you will begin, in small ways you won't notice until you catch yourself, to play a minor role. I caught myself twice. Once in the car, on the way to a December dinner, when I was thinking about what to say if Gerald brought up airport security again and I was rehearsing a graceful deflection rather than a correction, and I stopped and recognized the deflection as a capitulation and decided to correct directly instead. Once at the Christmas dinner when Gerald made the joke and the table laughed and I felt myself beginning to smile along with the laugh, and I stopped that too. You stop the small surrenders. You stop them one at a time. It is not dramatic. There is no music. You just do not smile at the joke, and you say, "I don't work in travel security, Gerald," and you eat your dinner. The shoulder is something I have not talked about enough in this story. I want to talk about it now. My left shoulder, which carries a 4-inch scar from the entry wound and the surgical repair of the structures beneath it, which includes a metal anchor and 2 synthetic structures that my physical therapist refers to by names I have memorized but do not fully understand, is a daily presence in my life. It aches in cold weather with a specificity that allows me to predict rain more accurately than most weather applications. It aches after I drive long distances. It aches in the particular way that structures under stress ache, which is not the sharp pain of acute injury, but the chronic low-grade presence of something that has been rebuilt and is working harder than it was designed to work. I do the exercises every morning. I have not missed a day in 4 years except for 3 days in the hospital after a follow-up procedure in 2021 that I scheduled and attended alone because it was outpatient and I did not want anyone to have to drive me. Edmund did not know about the procedure for 2 weeks when I mentioned it in passing. He said, "You had surgery and didn't tell me." I said it wasn't surgery, it was a procedure. He said, "V." I said it was fine, it went fine, I took a cab. He looked at me with an expression that I knew meant he understood something about me in that moment that he had not fully understood before. I did not explain it to him because the explanation would have taken longer than we had before dinner was ready. But the explanation, if I were to give it, would be this. I have been solving my own problems in silence for a long time. It is a habit built from a profession that does not reward asking for help unless the alternative is mission failure. And from growing up with a mother who got sick when I was young and who needed the help to go toward her and not away from her, and from 16 years of work in which the most important thing I carried was other people's safety rather than my own. You learn to manage your own costs quietly. You learn to take the cab. The surgery goes in a file. The file stays professional. I am working on this. Edmund is helping me work on this. It is new for both of us. I want to say something about Ambassador Ortega, because he deserves more than his role in the story's climax. He is a person who had spent his career in service to something larger than himself, which is one of the things I found I could say about very few people in the rooms I moved through, and which I found I could say about him from the first week of his protection detail in Bogotá. He was serious without being rigid. He had a dry humor that he deployed at his own expense rather than other people's. He asked me, about a month into my posting to his detail, how I had come to the DSS specifically, and I told him the short version, which was that I had studied international relations and then taken the State Department's security exam after a professor suggested I might be well suited for the work. He said, "The professor was right." I said, "Apparently." He said, "I have worked with many protection details in my career." He paused and said, "The good ones, the really excellent ones, have a quality I have never been able to name precisely. They are present without being intrusive. They read a room without appearing to look at it. They make a person feel safer without making a person feel small for needing safety." I said, "That's the training." He said, "No." He said, "Some of it is the training. The rest is character." He went back to his desk. I went back to my post. It is one of the things I think about when I think about what good work looks like. Work that is done with the fullness of who you are, rather than just the rehearsed competency of what you've been taught. That is the quality he named and couldn't name, and I have been trying to do my job that way since before he named it, and I have been trying harder since. After the gala, after the drive home with Edmund, after the particular honest silence of the parkway at 11 in the evening, I did not sleep for some time. I lay in the dark in our bedroom, with my left shoulder elevated the way I elevate it when it aches, and I thought about the story I had been in for the previous 2 years and what it had cost me and what I was going to do with the bill. The bill was real. The dismissals were real. Edmund's silence was real. Celeste's architectural management of my presence at her table was real. These things did not become less real because a diplomat had bowed in a ballroom. But something had shifted, not in the events, which could not be revised, but in the air around the events, which had changed its pressure. The room had caught up to the truth. The truth had been there the whole time. Now everyone who needed to know was standing in the same room with it. I thought about a woman I had worked with briefly at the training center in Dunloring. A woman named Elaine, who had been with the service for 23 years and who was one of the finest instructors I had trained under. She had said something to our cohort during a scenario debrief that I had written in a notebook that I kept through all my postings and that I still have somewhere in a drawer in our Alexandria house. She had said, "The most important thing you will ever do in this job will happen in a moment that looks like any other moment. Nobody will tell you it matters while it's happening. Nobody will hand you a citation on the spot. You will do it and it will be over and you will go back to your post," she said. The moment does not need your recognition of it to be the most important moment of your career. It knows what it is. You know what it is. That is enough. I thought about Elaine in the dark of our bedroom in Alexandria, and I thought about what I know and what it is, and I thought about the morning that was going to come and the gym at 5:30 and the shoulder exercises and the old truck in the driveway and the coffee Edmund would leave covered on the counter before he went back to sleep. I thought about the lunch with Celeste that I had agreed to, which was going to be uncomfortable in the specific way that imperfect attempts at revision are uncomfortable, full of silences and partial sentences and things almost said and then redirected. I thought about Edmund and what it meant to rebuild something that had been allowed to erode through silence. These were not simple things. They were not resolved. They were in motion. That is different from resolved and different from collapsed. And the distance between motion and collapse is the space in which a life actually happens. I went to sleep eventually. I woke up at 4:55 and lay still for 5 minutes. Then I got up, I drank the coffee, I drove to the gym, I did the exercises. The shoulder ached in the particular way it aches in March when the air is cold and damp and the river is still throwing cold off its surface into the city's air. I moved through the ache the way I have always moved through it. Not fighting it, not ignoring it, just carrying it at the particular angle that allows me to do the work and keep the range of motion and get through the morning with everything functioning the way it needs to function. That is what you do with the ache and with the rest of it. You carry it at the angle that works. You go to the gym, you come home, you do the next thing. The truth doesn't need you to perform it. The truth needs you to live it every morning in the rooms where nobody is watching and nobody is going to bow.